I'm Judy Oyedeli.
And I'm Sasha Farley. Welcome to Transformation Horizon.
This is a podcast all about organization development and the stories of practitioners from the field who are using OD to impact their community and society. Welcome to Transformation Horizon. Sasha, here we are again. I have a question for you. So it's fall, and I was walking through Rock Creek Park near my house and just enjoying a good Saturday. And I was thinking about some of my favorite snacks from childhood that make me feel super nostalgic. And I was like, ooh, you know what I could go for? I would really love a Lunchables, like the turkey and American Lunchables with the 2 Oreo cookies and the Capri Sun. I'm going to spring for the Capri Sun version because that's how fancy I am. So that was the nostalgic childhood snack that was coming to mind for me. But what is your, I'm just curious, what is your nostalgic childhood snack?
I don't think I've really ever thought about this, but your Lunchables reference really made me remember lunchtime where, you would trade things in your lunchbox. And my parents were really healthy. So I'd always have apples and fruit, and other people would have fruit by the foot. I remember just loving fruit by the foot or fruit roll-ups. And so I'd always try to switch, but no one would want to switch with me because
of
who
course
wants
not.
an apple instead of a fruit roll-up? So technically, I guess I could say fruit roll-ups and fruit by the foot. I guess I can say that makes me nostalgic for lunchtime trading. Lunchables are good though. I don't know why they're good. They're not healthy for you. They don't actually even taste like anything, but I still have fond memories of Lunchables.
It's plastic cheese, but it's delicious.
That is very true. Well, with that, let's transition to meet our guest for this month. We are welcoming Russ Gaskin. Russ helps people who don't know each other and often don't even like each other solve complex systemic challenges together, something that I definitely know I could use some help with figuring out how to do. He says that he feels most alive when he helps people collaborate meaningfully across the many boundaries that often separate us, whether those are organizational, structural, cultural, or political. Russ and the members of his consulting collaborative CoCreative have supported over 50 multi-stakeholder collaborations, and they also help others learn to lead transformational system change collaborations through training, coaching, and peer learning. Aside from his favorite pastime, having long chats with interesting people, Russ also gets kicks from riding his electric motorcycle, discovering new music, gardening, and learning Welsh, the language of his ancestors. So what I would like to do is pass off our check-in question to you. What snack makes you nostalgic for childhood?
That's pretty easy. We didn't have Lunchables or fruit by the foot when I was a kid. I don't think they were invented yet. So for me, it's just old-fashioned grilled cheese with cream of tomato soup.
Ooh,
I can always go for that.
that's a good one. That's a really good one. Now I want that for lunch. Oh, man. Okay. Well, Russ, I am so excited to have you here with us today. So when you and I first met all those years ago, you told me that you do systems change work. And immediately I was super fascinated and super excited to learn more about what that actually means. So I'm really glad that we have this time today, and we're going to dive into that concept through the perspective of this one project that you chose to highlight that you did a couple years ago. So I know the project is called the Clean Electronics Production Network, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we dive in and kind of get into the nitty gritty on that, can you explain some of the context around this, kind of help us understand the why behind what was going on, why this was needed in the first place?
Sure. So if you think of any product that you have, any electronic device, could be your phone, television, there's now loads of electronics packed into modern cars, for example. Every little piece of that device had to come through some kind of process, right? And there are many layers in those supply chains, all the way from getting the materials out of the ground, the raw materials, and refining those, and then turning those materials into components and putting those components together. And as you know, you've got many different components in just a cell phone today, right? And every step in that process involves chemicals in some way or another. Even just extracting raw material from the earth, they'll use chemicals to loosen up the ore from the surrounding earth. And right, so you've got lots of chemicals being used. And without getting too technical, broadly, there are two types of chemicals. One we might call component chemicals. So those are chemicals that would actually end up in the device, like a flame retardant, right? So if your house catches fire, hopefully your TV doesn't suddenly burst into flames when it gets close to something hot, right? And so those component chemicals are things that end up in the device versus a process chemical, which is something that's used to make the device, but doesn't end up in the device. So many, many years ago, electronics brands figured out, hey, we shouldn't have hazardous component chemicals in our devices because it's really not a good business policy to poison your customers, right? You don't want to have a cell phone with hazardous flame retardants right next to your ear as you're going through your day. Process chemicals, on the other hand, the effects weren't so immediate and the risks weren't so immediate. So you could have workers being exposed to very hazardous process chemicals while manufacturing a part or extracting an ore or the refining process or any number of steps, right? Thousands of different processes are used and thousands of different chemicals are used. And many of those chemicals are combinations of chemicals, like a mixture, and people don't really know actually how hazardous it is because it was kind of custom made or whatever. And then on top of that, you've got a supply chain. The global electronic supply chain employs somewhere around 18 million people.
Oh, wow.
So you've got 18 million people working in all these different contexts at all these different levels of supply chain, using all these different chemicals, many of which are carcinogenic, can cause sterility. Some of them are really bad. And so as folks were working on this issue, really for decades, there were lots of campaigners and worker advocates working on this issue, campaigning for worker safety and for lowering the toxicity of chemicals, et cetera. They weren't making a lot of progress. And people were becoming sterile or dying from leukemia or whatever. But anyone who looked at that system probably concluded, this is really complicated. No, this is really complex, like overwhelmingly complex.
It sounds overwhelmingly complex. There's a lot of different players involved in that. And so you did some stuff to help make this better. But I want to hear more about that. But yeah, that really helps set the framing of like how big of an issue. I mean, you said 18 million people are and can be affected by this. And I think that's helpful to keep in mind, like the scope and scale of the number of people who are impacted by these chemicals and the negative impacts that it can have. People had been advocating for this and trying to make some improvements in this for a long time, but weren't being successful. So where did the energy, like the critical energy to actually solve this problem or start making gains on solving this problem, where did that come from? And then how did you get involved?
Yeah, the energy, I love questions about energy because that's at the end of the day what it's all about for me. How do you build energy? How do you harness it, et cetera? And so some of the energy was coming from the fact that people had been working on it and advocating around this issue and running campaigns for so many years. And yet we're seeing very little, what I would call systemic process, right? You'd see isolated wins, but in a given facility with 1,000 workers out of 18 million, right? So clearly it wasn't reaching the scale that it needed to reach. And you would have people working in companies who were kind of overwhelmed. Like even if you work for the biggest electronics brand in the world, you look at this problem and think, we can't do this alone. And, we might account for 15% of one of our suppliers' business. As big as we are, that's not big enough to change that supplier's policies and practices. So I think it was a growing recognition, Judy, that people were coming to, that we had to come together at some level. We had to start collaborating. We had to work more collectively so that we could work more systemically. We could get at the root causes. We could affect, not necessarily in this case, policies, because countries like Mexico and China, they actually have good worker protection policies on the books.
Mm.
But that's a separate issue from what's actually happening in factories.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to engage market mechanisms, right? Like, how do you do contracting? How do you build the visibility of this issue and build solutions so that facilities can actually address the issue? And no one company was going to do that alone. I think that was the ultimate recognition that kind of prepared the ground.
Mm.
So it sounds like you had a lot of stakeholders, all who needed to come together to work on it. So it wasn't just these isolated wins, and really was the systemic change to make an impact across all of the stakeholders, right? A meaningful one, at least. You guys use the Clean Electronics Production Network to do this, right?
Yeah.
How did you guys figure out how to approach creating it? And like, what is the Clean Electronics Production Network?
The Clean Electronics Production Network is a multi-stakeholder collaboration. So you have folks from various companies involved, like HP, Dell, Apple, et cetera. And then you have worker advocates. So you have people who actually work with labor unions. In Mexico, for example, they work on worker exposures in various contexts in Asia. And maybe they're working more broadly on workers' rights, but worker exposures is often an issue that they're having to take on or to address in their organizing. When you have all these people in a room, and we would also, just to mix it up even more, Sasha, we've got academics and we've got folks from government agencies, right? And we've got maybe, sometimes funders in the room, right? And we've got all this different mix of cultures and orientations and what people, the mix of values that people bring, et cetera. And I think it was really a question of, we need this. At some level, people recognized we need that diversity because we're all only seeing, if you know the Sufi story, one part of the elephant, right?
Mm-hmm.
And getting all that diversity in the room and making it work was the real challenge. Convincing people that we needed to be in the room together was also a challenge initially. But I think once people experienced the power of having all that difference in the room and leveraging the different insights, perspectives, experience, expertise, knowledge, et cetera, they got into it. And suddenly it was like, wow, this makes a lot of sense. Because there are things that the worker advocates and worker representatives can bring to the table and do out in the world that others just couldn't do or wouldn't even know.
Oof. Yeah, I'm just thinking about like being in that room, or like the first day of that room actually existing and everyone coming together. That would feel almost overwhelming. The amount of different perspectives, different needs, different, just everything. I'm sure there must have been people with just fundamentally opposed like views on the situation or on the issue, even though at the heart of it, they might be wanting the same outcomes, but the approach that they feel is appropriate to taking to getting there that's always going to be different when especially when you bring in academics or the government or like the advocates, like but I guess I hear what you're saying. Like that's like the beauty of it, is that they are bringing those different perspectives into one space, and it can be really powerful.
Yeah, and I think you're bringing together things that out in the world have been separated.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, companies tend to focus on things that are doable, feasible, measurable. We can produce some quick early wins because they have internal accountabilities, right? So what are you going to do this quarter? What are you going to do in the next 6 months? And they've got to deliver visible results. The worker folks are interested in deep transformational change that might take years. They also want results, right? But that was one of the tensions that was kind of out there already. By bringing it into the room, we could say, hey, that's actually a polarity or something that we need to kind of put together. How can we have a strategy that's transformational and systemic and produce quick early wins within that? And suddenly it became a creative tension as opposed to a polarizing kind of destructive tension.
And honestly, when I'm hearing all of this, thinking about someone who does OD, even in sometimes bigger systems, definitely not worldwide global systems, it seems overwhelming. How did you figure out how to approach this project and make it like even manageable to get your mind around to attack it?
Well, the scope was really challenging, Sasha, as you can imagine. We can't take on that whole system. There are two things that we did early on that I think really helped. Both of you have used the word overwhelm. In our book, that's a good thing. So the first thing we did was we do a lot of stakeholder interviews up front, a lot of one-on-ones, because we're trying to create a map so that everybody can kind of get to the extent possible, we can get a shared picture of what's going on in that system. We're also in those interviews building relationships. So people are developing, they have someone they can trust who's involved in facilitating the collaboration. We're also, though, we were drafting and testing and iterating on a powerful goal. I don't remember the first versions, but we ended up with something like eliminating worker exposures to hazardous process chemicals in the global electronics supply chain. And that goal itself was kind of overwhelming. But it was also energizing, right? Going back to energy again, people were like, that's cool. If we could do that, I would be so happy, and that would be so cool, and that would be so meaningful. In some ways, the power of the goal transcended everyone's individual goals and everyone's individual jobs. It didn't matter what you were doing, you could connect to that. We did, not everybody connected to that. Some trade groups were like, well, we can't promise that, but a lot of the people who are energized by it, those are the people we wanted in the room. And then what we did was we took all these insights about this huge complex system and we made what we call a system landscape map. And that was basically unpacking what's going on in the system with the different actors in the system, with signals and boundaries of different player parts of the system, et cetera. And it ended up, in this case, being a really huge map. I remember our first convening was at an Apple facility, and we covered, I don't know how big it was, probably 40 feet long and 8 feet tall. That was our map.
Holy smokes.
Maybe 30 feet long. Anyway, it seemed overwhelmingly huge. And it took us 3 hours to walk through this system. And as you can imagine, after we did that, people were just kind of sitting there feeling overwhelmed. And that's also the point at which people started to let go of their preferred analyses, their hypotheses, their assumptions, their solutions that they were coming in. I'm going to get everybody to buy into this solution because I think this is the bomb. There was a lot of letting go, just kind of shedding of that stuff. The reason we worked so hard on that goal, that was our first thing that we were really testing and refining, was that's the thing that through all that overwhelm kept everyone together. Look, this is overwhelming. We know this system is complicated. We know this is possibly impossible, but maybe doable. But that goal is so important. We need to work through this uncertainty, this complexity, this fear, all the things people were experiencing. So that was a beautiful moment. The moment of overwhelm, that was a beautiful moment.
Oof.
I love the way you reframe that, because so many times, right, when you work in complex systems or even simple systems, everyone comes with their own perspectives, right? Because by the very nature of being human, the way our brains work, we think we know and understand more than we do. It's just kind of how we've evolved, right? So I love the idea of not like taking that away from people, like explicitly and pointing it out, but just being like, this is actually what's happening with data. and just let people naturally realize that they don't know everything, and how that can open people's minds. That sense of overwhelm can allow people to take their own barriers down, to admit in whatever process they need to do, internally, externally, like, oh, this is way bigger than I thought. I didn't know about half that stuff, right? Maybe I don't know what the solution is, to allow like for the combined creation of ideas. Because then it really sits in this message that I know a lot of us OD practitioners and people who do OD try to get across, right? That it's like, you know your part really well, but you don't know this other part really well. The person who does this work knows that part better. So that's why we try to bring diverse perspectives together, so that they can talk and share those perspectives and bring something and create something together with their shared knowledge overall, right? So I love the idea of overwhelm being a good thing, to allow those like barriers to come down. So just that just gave me like good vibes all over.
Chills.
Yeah, and in complexity, they refer to that as, or some theorists refer to that as the principle of darkness, which to me sounds a little bit too close to the Prince of Darkness. But no, the principle of darkness is just what you were saying, Sasha. It encapsulates that idea that no single stakeholder or even organization in any complex system can know all of the system. And so all of us have a lot of darkness, kind of blind spots, you might say, or whatever. There's all the other parts of the elephant that we simply can never see, no matter how smart we are, no matter how capable we are, et cetera. And so that's something I think that funders are starting to realize when they're working on these complex issues. As much as they thought in the past, we can figure this out, we can get a theory of change and execute on it, and everything's going to start changing. I think they're starting to realize they have blind spots. They're only seeing a part of the elephant, and more coming to the conclusion we need more diversity. We need people who are closer to the issue, not just at the table, but helping to shape and frame the analysis and the strategy.
Once you have everyone at that point, right, where they're ready to like, okay, I got my walls and my own preconceived notions down, I'm ready to like understand that we need to work together to tackle this. Is there like a framework or something that you use to help design how you're going to have all those conversations and like work and co-create together?
Yeah, the one we tend to rely on seems to be very nuanced and unclear to people initially, but it's actually very simple. And that is, and this is an example of how we use a more dialogic approach. How do we talk through and think through these things together, as opposed to a diagnostic approach? Because often folks will approach complex systems by creating a causal loop diagram or some kind of very diagnostic map where you're mapping the forces and the loops and et cetera, and you're identifying intervention points. In our case, once we did that with clean electronics, once we did that huge map and we went through that for several hours, we asked folks, what parts of this picture, if we're to achieve this goal that we've set out to do, what parts of this picture most need to shift? And people might look at, oh, there's policy, there's contracting, there's the incentives and disincentives around facility managers who make decisions about which chemicals to use. There are design decisions upstream. So a designer decides, oh, we're going to use this component. Suddenly that has implications for what chemicals are used in the actual production. So that's another point at which we really want that diversity in the room, because if I'm a policy person, I'm going to look at that map and every shift is going to be about policy. If I'm a communications person, I'm going to look at that map and everything is a communications problem. But a shift is simply, how does that part of the picture look now? It's a very simple statement. So today, facility chemical purchasers are highly incentivized to use the lowest cost chemical to the neglect of other considerations. And now, how does that need to look in the future if we're going to be successful in achieving our goal? So it could be something like facility managers are making decisions about chemical purchases that integrate safety considerations or something like that, right? And so when we went into that room, we didn't go in with no shifts drafted. We, in networks that we support, we have a structure called the design team, and that's our equivalent of like a steering committee or executive committee, except in our process, the network makes the decisions together. The design team isn't a decision-making body, at least initially. And so what they're doing is they were looking at early versions of the map, and they were starting to draft some of these shifts. And then we brought those into the room after the map. And we said, hey, let's start to coalesce on which of these we think are the highest leverage shifts. For example, if this shift were to happen, all these other shifts would happen more easily. And so by agreeing on shifts before we get to solutions, we're actually agreeing on what are the problem areas we need to focus on. Like we're defining and agreeing on the problem spaces before we get to the interventions or solutions or whatever we're going to actually do, right? And I think a lot of times people go from, here's the landscape map, here's what's going on. Now let's do ideation, let's brainstorm, let's figure out what we're going to do about that. And putting that shifts process in between is really, really, really helpful, because that gives us a basis for agreeing on which solutions make sense.
I'm thinking about like other like stakeholder engagement or like even just like process change work that I've done with multiple stakeholders. And you're right. It goes from, well, we created the map or we created the logic model. Now everybody look at it and then go brainstorm ways to fix it. Okay, great. And then we're going to just battle to the death with you, or you fight for your idea. And it's not as, it always feels like it's compromising to find like the lowest common denominator of like, what's the thing that the most people will agree with, rather than what is the one or two things that are actually going to make the most impact to the goal we're trying to achieve.
We've seen that dynamic often, Judy, and I don't think it actually showed up in clean electronics in this way, but I would call that putting what's feasible over what's meaningful. And so often when we're starting brainstorming, for example, we're going to say something like, feasibility is off the table. Don't think about what's feasible. Don't consider the feasibility of something, et cetera. And start generating ideas for how we can make X shift happen, right? Mm. And so that helps, but also we might do what we call an impact and feasibility matrix, which I think we actually did with clean electronics at some point, but it's a way to kind of play with that, again, polarity or tension, what's feasible and what's meaningful. And, we come up with things like, hey, this is really meaningful, but not very feasible. Maybe that's more a long-term thing. Mm-hmm. This one is pretty meaningful and very feasible. Let's get started there. And by putting these together, we kind of make a map, almost like a roadmap for how to string these ideas together, assuming that they relate to one another. And so it deals with this short-term transformational dynamic, et cetera. But yeah, sometimes when we've done the landscape map and the shifts, and then we start to brainstorm ideas, groups have come back, frankly, with pretty lame ideas in the first round. And that's where, again, there's somebody in the network who's going to say, folks, this is not going to do it, That's again where the diversity comes in. Everybody's kind of glomming onto what's doable, feasible, what we can do in the first year. And always there are a few voices who say, this is not acceptable. This is not going to achieve that goal that we've set out to do. Let's go back to the table and rethink this. As you can see, diversity is a constant in our work.
Yeah.
Not just diversity, difference. Because you can have diversity, but not really leverage the difference, right?
Using it as a strength, the differences.
One thing that's coming up, and I'm really loving this reframing, the concept, right, that it's about coming together to have that dialogue, right? I'm thinking through our 4OD lenses that we use in these discussions, bringing people together so like all of this is co-created in a dialogue way, right? Using that framework of what's the shift that we want to do can really help, I think, open up minds to different solutions that you might not have thought about, because sometimes looking at what's the change can be like, well, what's the action that needs to help you do that change? And then the systems thinking element, obviously this entire thing is systems thinking because you have representatives from the entire systems in the room. So they're all going to be coming from their own perspectives, and the mapping that you guys were able to do with it, which definitely unlocked thinking. And then the participation and diverse perspectives element is 100% here as well. I'm thinking a lot about how the very way in which you guys are designing this helps everyone involved learn, right? In a way, in a really impactful way, because they're hearing from all the other stakeholders and getting a better sense of the full picture through this process that you've broken down very nicely into like, I can address this one piece. What is it doing? Like, what do we want it to look like to achieve our goal? And then what's that shift? And looking at that breaks it down into manageable pieces. One thing that we like to talk about here, though, right, is once you do all that and you drive towards action so that you can get the actual end impact, how do you then take all of that up and then ensure that a network of such diverse stakeholders are working together to then implement or do the actions that come up from these sort of conversations? Like, how do you coordinate all of that?
Yeah, Sasha, there's that question of how you coordinate it. And then there's the question of this is the moment of truth. The rubber has to hit the road. We actually have to do things. And in the context of clean electronics or other, probably almost any network that we support, part of that moment of truth is, oh, we did this stuff in this network. Now we've got to go back and do this in our organizations. And that's where you get the real OD thing happening. So people made commitments, for example, in the context of clean electronics to eliminating certain chemicals or whatever. And then there's a moment at which they realize, oh, wait, I got to go sell my company on this. And I'm going to have to learn how to be a stronger leader back home. Because it's one thing to be in this great space together with facilitators and this process and et cetera, and everything seems to be working. It's another to go back and do the organizational alignment and change. So I think there's learning constantly at so many levels. It's one of the 4 agendas that we refer to, the learning agenda. And folks have to learn how to be stronger leaders, how to be stronger advocates, how to influence others. Everybody comes to the table with some of those, and all of those are strengthened in the work together. One of the beautiful experiences I had was we were supporting a different collaboration in the food and egg sector. And there was a point at which one of the participants came up, and I think this was probably 2 years into the collaboration, who worked for a very large food processing and transportation company. And he said, I just have to say, I really, really, really appreciate the way we work in this network. And to be honest, it's transformed the way I lead in my own company. And that wasn't our intent. That's not why the network exists, right? But there was this epidemic of mindsets and practices. And once people experienced it, they were starting to bring it back home and be more inclusive, more equitable, more collaborative leaders. And I think at the end of the day, more productive leaders, because they themselves directly experience what that's like.
There's something very powerful about just seeing a different option actually play out and work well. Because there's lots of different issues going on in the world where I feel like instead of trying to retrofit the current system or like undo something that's been around for 200 years and is like has deep roots and is ingrained, how about the people who just want to do something different get together and do it differently and then show everybody else, hey, there's another option here. And we did it. And then like the ripple effects that can have And like what you're talking about of how like that experience that people had and were able to take away from being a part of this network just rippled out and like created so much change in these organizations for these people as individuals, for them as leaders. Oh, it's so exciting to think about. Like, it just really makes me so happy. Oh,
Yeah, Judy, one of my mentors, Susan Davis, who has a process called KINS, which is basically a multi-stakeholder collaboration framework too. And she had started, I think, over the years, 40 something different multi-stakeholder collaborations. Susan has what I consider the most beautiful way of summarizing, well, an approach to this work, and certainly my philosophy to this work, which is if you want to change the world, throw a better party. Now, a better party doesn't mean it's always fun, right? A better party is it's more meaningful, it's more inclusive, it's more joyful, right? So there is that element. And I think often we think of collaboration as cumbersome, slow, painful, lowest common denominator, not very meaningful, etc. And nothing gives me more juice than kind of flipping that stereotype or that myth, because it's really, when it's done well, it's just the opposite. It is a better party, and it becomes contagious. It's like, I like this so much, I want to do this with other people. So at first I was like, yeah, I love that phrase, I love that statement. Susan really kind of hit the mark on something. But now more and more, I just think of that as my core philosophy about this work. How are we going to throw a better party that's meaningful, that's joyful, that's engaging, that, you know, where people are bringing their whole selves, heads, spirits, hearts, hands, feet, everything.
all of it. Amazing. Okay, one question that has been kind of like noodling around in the back of my mind, like I'm getting like so like pumped up just from this conversation because it's like so
It's a
fun.
better party.
Yeah, it's a better party. I love it. Okay, so help me understand, what was the timeline for this project? I think you mentioned briefly like something around 2 years in. So like what was the scope, the kind of total timeline?
So the goal is to eliminate worker exposures to hazardous chemicals. I would ask rhetorically, what's the timeline for that? So, you know, most of the networks we support, they're taking on things that are very long term, in some cases intergenerational. If you're going to, actually, I'll give you an example. 2002, Susan and another colleague of mine started a multi-stakeholder collaboration called Solar Circle. But within a couple of years, they had settled on a goal. We start with the goal, but at that time, they kind of evolved the goal once they had the people in the room. And the goal was to have 50% of global energy supply coming from solar by the year 2050. They formed in 2002. And so that was 46, 48 years that they were going to be working on that goal, presumably. Now they're actually on track to achieve that goal much sooner than 2050. So maybe they're not going to meet for 46 years or whatever. But as you can imagine, that is truly intergenerational. There are people who pass away in that period and new people who join, and they're still meeting today. 20 years later, they're still gathering regularly. The things they're working on now, the system interventions, are different. Now they're working on storage and grid policy and grid pricing. Before, they were working on things like silicon supply and national policy in China and the US and Canada. And so the work is necessarily going to evolve. The problems that you're working on at any given point will be different. But most of the groups are in it until they win it, in some sense. They're in it to actually realize that goal that they adopted.
How long does it take to like form one of these networks? Because I can see once it's established, their work being as short or as long term as their goal implies, right? But it also seems like there's a substantial amount of work of even starting and kicking off the network itself? Like, how long does that typically take for you guys?
It depends. To Judy's question, clean electronics, I think that started in 2015, something like that. I can't remember the exact year. So they've been going for a while now, 7 years or something like that. And again, they have different priorities now. They're advancing different solutions given the context. And they, to some extent, the network itself has evolved. There are some different companies involved that weren't involved before, things like that. That took a long time to start up. And usually when we're being challenged to start up a collaboration, there are a couple things happening. One is we're working in an industry or a space where people just aren't that familiar with this multi-stakeholder approach. So sometimes we prefer the devil we know to the devil we don't. And this looks a little bit odd and unusual, and they're a little bit skeptical. Sometimes there are existing initiatives that look very similar to what we're proposing, but they're actually not. So often companies would say, we're working with such and such a trade group to address this issue of chemical exposures, and we think that's, we're taking care of it through that. And we couldn't really explain how this was different. It got to the point actually with clean electronics where we kind of had to just show it rather than talk about it, because there was no way we could talk about collaborative innovation, which is what we call our process, in a way that didn't get translated into something else in people's minds. And so we actually got two of the companies, HP and Apple, and some of the other groups, very, very small group though. And we just did a quick kind of innovation process in an afternoon and a morning. So a little landscape map, a little set of shifts, generating some interventions together, et cetera, just to demo the process. And so we got to noon the next day and we said, so how did this work? And people were like, cool, we're in. And then, that we were being strategic. Once we had Apple and HP, we knew they had influence. And so we were able to get other companies at the table and a trade group, et cetera. But sometimes it's just like, this is so unfamiliar. That's the biggest barrier to resistance. So that, Sasha, might have taken 18 months. Usually it's more like 9 months, maybe 6, depending on the complexity and the breadth of the scope of the problem and things like that. Oh, I would add, Sasha, the beautiful thing though is it's kind of the go slow to go fast thing. Because we've done all these interviews, because we've done so much work in developing a powerful, energetic goal, because we have not just built relationships amongst ourselves, but connected people in all that startup process. Once we get in the room in a day and a half, we go from affirming the working goal to having our draft set of interventions. Wow. So the process, once we have that foundation and that kind of groundwork done, is very, very fast. And that energizes people too, because that flips the narrative about the pace of collaboration and how effective collaboration can be.
Yeah, that's super powerful. Like, it's good to spend time laying the foundation. I'm thinking about one of the conversations we had around local government and how things work there, right? It can be slow, and then once it's ready, it can go fast, right? Laying foundations is so crucial, and this is just showing how much it makes a difference, right? Like, if you skip the foundation setting, then it creates the churn that can lose the energy, right? Versus if you spend the time in the foundations, the relationships building, the trust building, right? And design the best party, right? Then you can get that speed that keeps people on board and keeps people interested, which is really what I think we need to tackle some of these global societal challenges and environmental challenges, all the different challenges that it sounds like these networks that you guys create are trying to tackle. So that just leaves me with a lot of energy. And I think it's a good reminder for all of us. Don't skip the foundations and the relationships.
Yeah, in some ways, we don't think of our work as helping the group solve the problem per se. Obviously, that's what we're doing, but we're focused more on creating the conditions that support or maybe that allow effective collaboration to emerge. The engagement, the inclusion, the accountability, the momentum, all the things that we've kind of mentioned here. How do we create the conditions so that those things are present in the group? And then it just engages our natural desire to do things together, to do meaningful work, to be creative, right? It allows for all those things to happen that otherwise don't happen because we don't have the trust, we don't have the accountability, we don't have the commitment, whatever it is, right?
And that kind of leads me to my next question around how did this experience impact you on a personal level?
I think, Sasha, I do the work that I do because I need hope. I'm out there working on these big global issues or, helping communities work on their challenges, et cetera. At the end of the day, there is this selfish element of I draw hope from it. And we all need hope, as you said. And if I can't get it somewhere, I'm going to make it. Seeing people come together, work across these deep differences, these organizational, sectoral, political, cultural boundaries, all these things that separate us, do meaningful work together, man, there's no better juice.
I can definitely imagine that feels really good to be doing that type of work. All right. So, Russ, what nugget of advice or wisdom or warning would you give to people who are hearing this story and are thinking, oh, I want to do something similar, or I want to do something similar, or I want to get into like systems change work and start working in that way? Anything you'd like to share?
I don't know if these relate to systems change work specifically, Judy. They might just relate to helping diverse groups collaborate, which to me is more systemic. When you're bringing people together across these boundaries, and for the first time, they're aligning on a shared purpose and they're sharing a picture of that complex landscape, you will be working more systemically. So the two things that come to mind, one is be aware of and develop help of your relationship with fear, with resistance, with uncertainty, with conflict, and try to develop really healthy relationships with those, because you are going to be scared and you are going to be overwhelmed by the complexity. And I love this. A friend of mine, Jennifer Hamady, wrote this book, The Art of Singing. And in the book, she talks about, how Franklin Delano Roosevelt said in, was it 1931 or whatever, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. She said, I would suggest a different way of thinking about this, which is the only thing we have to fear is having an unhealthy relationship with fear. And in the context of singing and vocal performance, she was pointing out, if you've ever seen someone perform, a singer who had no fear, it was probably a very uninteresting performance, because it gives energy and focus and dynamism, and right. And so kind of changing our relationship with what we often think of as the baddies, I think is really key in terms of myself as an individual doing this kind of work. In terms of the group, over many years, we've asked this question in our training, which is, what does it take for people to collaborate effectively for systemic change? And then we'll ask the group to generate. So everybody generate as many things as you can, one item per post-it or virtual sticky or whatever. And then we started to cluster those things. And after many, many times of doing that, we started to see 4 things really emerge as consistent and common. Those were what we call the connecting agenda. So are we connecting the right people in trusting relationships to do what we're setting out to do? Second is what we call the aligning agenda. Are we aligned around the greater shared purpose the goals, how we're going to measure success, the indicators, metrics, whatever. Third is what we call the learning agenda, which you've referred to. What do we need to learn together? And how are we learning about ourselves and the way this system is working? So that's that landscape map. And as if we all have different pictures, we've learned different things about the system. Of course, we're going to have different strategies, right? And then finally, what we ended up calling the making agenda, which is, hey, we can be connected in trusting relationships, aligned around a shared purpose, learning, but we got to make stuff, people. We got to make interventions and strategies and get stuff done in the real world. And we later realized connecting relates to the heart, aligning in our thinking relates to the spirit. Like, Judy, Sasha, if we were all aligned around a transcendent shared purpose in our lives, there's a spiritual experience in that, right? And then, the learning and the making, the learning has to do with the head, obviously, and the making is our feet and our hands. And we realize, wow, that's it. It's about whole people. How do we engage all of ourselves and bring all of ourselves into the work that we're doing? And in some ways, if we can do that, then we've got it. We got all that difference. We've got whole people showing up. Again, that's systemic in and of itself. You don't need fancy system maps and whatever to figure out what to do if you've got those conditions.
That is really powerful. I feel like I could talk to you forever about this. It's very fascinating, and there's a lot of elements to it, and it's really powerful because it does bring hope, right? Like, you guys are tackling the challenges that I think stress a lot of us out, where it feels like this big, hairy problem, I think, as some people say, right? It's like, how do we even address some of these things? And the structure that you guys have created seems to do it in like a positive way, instead of switching some of those negative emotions, like the overwhelm, the fear, like what conflict means, into a positive viewpoint, which I think is very powerful as we look at where we are right now in the world and all the big, scary, systemic problems that we need to be addressing. So one thing that I want to ask is, how can people help support the Clean Electronics Production Network or other networks that you guys support?
That's a really good question. They're all so different, and they have different organizations involved and different backbone organizations. In other words, different organizations that are there to support the collaboration itself. I would suggest one way would be to support, there's an organization called Green America, and Green America has the Center for Sustainability Solutions, which supports multiple of these collaborations. So Clean Electronics Production Network is one of them. The Soil Climate Alliance is another, which is advancing regenerative agriculture and advancing climate solutions through agriculture. And they just do really good work on a range of really, really important issues that are very, very hard to address any other way. Other things would be in your own community. If you see a multi-stakeholder collaboration, how can you get involved in supporting it, even if you're just a volunteer showing up and taking out the recycling and putting snacks on the table?
I really love that. And we'll put the links to Green America Network and other resources in the show notes for people if they want to get involved. I want to thank you, Russ, for being on the show, sharing your story. And I want to give you the space. Is there anything that you would like to promote?
No, I think just promoting us, getting out there, rolling up our sleeves, getting in the room together with a bunch of difference, and throwing a better party.
Perfect. If people wanted to get in touch and learn more about the work that you're doing, how can they connect with you?
I think the easiest way is wearecocreative.com, or they could reach out to me on LinkedIn, either way.
Thank you so much, Russ. This was like such an energizing conversation, and it was so fun to get to connect with you again, but then also like really dive in and explore this project, but then just all of the amazing, amazing work that you all are doing at CoCreative. So thank you so much for taking the time and joining us today. and help us continue the conversation. So share your own OD stories by using the hashtag OD Horizon Stories. And make sure to check out the show notes for this episode. And we're going to add all the links there. But we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Transformation Horizon. Special thanks to IOTA for sponsoring us and Melissa for editing and additional production support.
Contact us at transformationhorizon@gmail.com and use the hashtag OD Horizon Stories to tell us your stories. See you next time.